Alright, at this point I think I'm probably going to end up making a video about every single one of Robert Eggers' movies because they're so psychologically and symbolically rich. And today I'm going to be sharing what I interpret as the psychological meaning behind The Lighthouse. Honestly, out of all of Eggers' movies, this was the one that I struggled the most to understand, that I actually had to rewatch a few times to truly think about it. So please let me know your own thoughts about my own interpretation or about the movie in the comments down below, because I'm sure there's a lot that I'm probably missing. But without further ado, let's talk about what I think is the psychological meaning behind The Lighthouse. So The Lighthouse takes place in 1890s New England. Ephraim Winslow and Thomas Wake are two lighthouse keepers on a very remote island in the ocean. Ephraim seems to be the more primary protagonist, and at first he seems to be a little bit startled by Thomas. Thomas basically forces him to drink alcohol the first night. He seems very erratic. He's very hard on Ephraim. He won't let him tend to the lantern room. Ephraim takes the day shift and Thomas takes the night shift. And the night before they're supposed to leave back to the mainland, a big storm hits. Ephraim gets into a fight with a seagull. He ends up killing the seagull, and that makes the winds turn. That brings on the storm. That night, the men drink together, and things start to go downhill from there. Of course, the boat doesn't come for them because of the storm, and that's when Ephraim really descends into madness. He starts losing time, drinking on the job, yelling, fighting. He also tells Thomas his backstory. There was a man named Ephraim who he was going to kill, but he ended up deciding not to, and then the man just died by slipping. So this man, whose real name is also Thomas, ended up stealing Ephraim's identity. But for the sake of clarity, I'm going to keep calling him Ephraim throughout this video since the other guy is also called Thomas. This was one thing that I didn't quite understand. If you understand like who this Ephraim guy was or why they were gonna kill each other. The backstory is the part that kind of confuses me, so definitely let me know about that. But eventually Ephraim and Thomas fight. After many rounds, Ephraim finally wins. He finally manages to get the keys to go up to the lantern room, where he experiences some sort of emotional climax before falling to his demise, where seagulls end up eating his entrails. Now, a lot of people seem to think that The Lighthouse is about repressed homoerotic desire. After all, Ephraim finds a siren statue hidden in his bed, and the siren is calling to him in his dreams. Sirens are often a symbol for repressed desire, for the allure for something. Thomas also calls Ephraim pretty as a picture, and he tells him, "You're fond of me, lobster." I'm not sure what that means. I'm assuming it's some sort of phallic joke. There's this random scene of Thomas's ass humping the air. The lighthouse is sometimes seen as a phallic symbol, and when we hear Thomas moaning up in the lantern room and saying that the light is the only woman he needs, it makes it seem like maybe that's what he means. It also feels pretty homoerotic when, as they descend into madness, they almost kiss while dancing, they fight in a way that's very physical, and then they cuddle. So I can see why with these elements, at face value, people might think it's about homoerotic desire, but I personally don't think it's about that, and let me explain why. I believe that the two characters in The Lighthouse are actually split off parts of the same person. Thomas towards the end even says, "I'm probably a figment of your imagination. This rock too." So if we're going with this theory that Ephraim and Thomas are two parts of the same person, there are a few different possibilities. One possibility is that Ephraim is the more self-restrained version of him, whereas Thomas is his more shadowy alter ego, his unrestrained, erratic, mad self. And Thomas is the one who, up until the end, has all the actual authority and power. When he forces Ephraim to drink the first night, it's kind of like watching someone with alcohol addiction negotiate between the part of them that wants to drink and the part of them that wants to practice self-restraint. And ultimately, in this case, the part that wants to let loose is more powerful, has more authority. And as Ephraim descends into madness, he starts to say, "I am Thomas." And like I said, in the movie, his name is also literally Thomas because he stole somebody else's identity. But on an allegorical level, I think this shows how he is becoming his shadow version, how he's becoming usurped by the more erratic alcoholic side of him. And especially when the two men dig up buried alcohol, I perceived that as retrieving his repressed desire to drink from the unconscious. So maybe in a way this is a movie about a man's inner conflict with alcoholism. Now, a second possibility is that Thomas represents the id, Ephraim represents the ego, and the lighthouse represents the superego. So this is per a very Freudian way of conceptualizing the mind, where the id is the more animalistic, primal, impulsive version of us. The superego is the very morally restrained version of us, and the ego is the mediator between the two, between the id and the superego. Now, obviously, Thomas is the more animalistic, impulsive version of himself. He is the tentacled monster. He is the beast in the unconscious, because the ocean is often a symbol for the unconscious. And the lighthouse is the thing that brings repressed unconscious content to the light. When in the last scene, Ephraim goes to the lantern room, the lantern is kaleidoscopic, it's bright, it's alluring like the siren, and he stares into it and he touches it. It's blinding, it's climactic. He begins cackling and screaming maniacally, and then he falls to his demise. I wonder if this is kind of like a metaphorical representation of seeing the light, seeing what's repressed and unconscious. So is the message that sometimes seeing what we've repressed ends up killing us? Or is it just that it kills the part of us that was in denial, maybe? And Ephraim is the one trying to navigate between the id and the superego. He's trying to navigate both Thomas and the lighthouse, just like the ego negotiates between the id and the superego. And then a third possibility is that Ephraim represents the conscious and Thomas represents the unconscious. Ephraim is begging to be led into the lantern room, to be brought into the light to see what lies in the unconscious. And as repressed unconscious matter starts seeping more and more into his consciousness, like when we see images of the men who died interspersed with lustful images of the siren, and he goes madder and madder as that repressed unconscious material starts to come to the surface. It's basically a metaphor for what happens when the defenses go down to reveal what's in the unconscious. And when Ephraim tries to escape and Thomas chases and stops him, it's kind of like our conscious selves being chased by our unconscious past. And then we sort of see that the conscious and the unconscious selves swap. When the dark unconscious material is brought to the light, the shadow, meaning Thomas, is no longer the shadow. And that's why Thomas starts seeming like the more and more lucid one towards the end, whereas Thomas has become the shadow. Now, if we operate under the assumption that Thomas and Ephraim are two parts of the same whole, we see how the conflict between them really reflects a sense of self-loathing. The protagonist actually has a ton of self-hatred from his past sins, from his guilty conscience. We see that Thomas was keeping a list of all of Ephraim's infractions, basically like keeping tabs on his own sins, the way that our own inner critic might do. We also see Ephraim going off on Thomas, which basically is like confronting who he really is underneath the defenses. And when the two men fight, it's kind of like what an inner conflict feels like. The two parts of the self basically trying to kill each other. Now, Ephraim wins. He forces Thomas to start barking. He makes him crawl like a dog on a leash, makes him get into a ditch and buries him alive. It's a really uncomfortable scenario where it shows the power play between two parts of the self, how one wins and tries to subjugate and humiliate the other side. It gets really ugly when you have two parts of yourself trying to ruin each other. Now, what about the seagull? What does the seagull represent? So Thomas tells Ephraim that inside the seabirds are the souls of sailors, and that's why it's bad luck to kill them. Thomas himself was a sailor. He lost his family because he was away at sea for 13 years with little kids at home. And I thought that the relationship between seagulls, sailors, and lighthouse keepers was really interesting. I honestly don't even think I fully understood the relationship between these three symbols. The only thing I could really think of was, is there inside each man maybe a sailor and a lighthouse keeper? The one who's sailing through a dark ocean of unconscious matter, and the one who must shine a light on the darkness. But of course, Ephraim does end up killing a seagull, which makes the wind turn, which brings the storm that keeps them stranded on the rock. And in the final scene, we see that seagulls are eating Ephraim's entrails. I found that this final scene was very reminiscent of the legend of Prometheus, a titan who defied the gods by giving fire to humans. His punishment was to be bound to a rock while an eagle ate his liver every night. Now, fire here in this legend can be the same symbol as the lighthouse. Illumination, bringing light to the darkness, bringing the unconscious to the conscious. When we defy the gods and bring to light what's in the dark, it can be sometimes as painful as an eternity of having your innards eaten by a bird. And there are some motifs in the movie suggesting a similar type of Promethean repetition loop. Thomas talks about how the last keeper who was at the lighthouse with him went mad, raving about sirens and an enchantment with the light. Maybe that last keeper was Ephraim himself. Maybe he's in a repetition loop. Maybe this is Ephraim's punishment for his repressed sins. He's condemned to repress and discover, repress and rediscover, over and over and over again, his unending hell. And that would make sense given that there was also other Greek mythology referenced in the movie, like Thomas calls upon Neptune, the god of the sea. There were also parts where I wondered if maybe this was a movie about loneliness and how you can go kind of crazy when you're isolated. In the very first scene where we see a ship approaching a desolate lighthouse on a rock in the middle of the ocean, it kind of does feel like retreating from society into the self, like the tarot card of the hermit. And Thomas mentions that boredom makes the lighthouse keepers go mad. I found this very relatable as a person who uses a lot of what's called manic defenses, who has to always be go, 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 always doing something, always working, because sometimes that is a defense mechanism to not look at your own unconscious shit in the face. And so in the context of like a situation where you're isolated on a rock in the middle of the ocean, sometimes keeping busy is the only thing tethering you to reality. And actually in my upcoming novel, A Song at Dead Man's Cove, there is a lighthouse, and in that novel, the lighthouse represents kind of like confinement, somebody going kind of mad because of loneliness. And if you want to know when that book comes out, definitely make sure you're subscribed to my email newsletter, which you can find at dranayudin.com. And then the siren, like I said, often represents the allure of the unconscious, or maybe desire or lust for connection when you're going mad from isolation. What did you think about all this? Which of the interpretations do you think is most likely, or maybe is there an interpretation that I haven't even considered? Is it about alcoholism? Is it loneliness, repression caused by a guilty conscience, homoerotic desire, or something else altogether? I hope that this video is interesting to you, and I'll see you soon.